Hello, welcome to the Breaking Barriers, Inspiring Stories channel. Subscribe to the channel to always follow our stories. Attention, this is a fictional story. The events of this story did not really happen. It is just a fantasy about overcoming. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Mr. John's small apartment. At 72, he had settled into a comfortable routine. His days started early, with a cup of coffee and the soft murmur of a radio playing in the background. Mr. John enjoyed these peaceful moments of solitude, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the kitchen as he quietly reflected on the years gone by. His apartment, modest but tidy, sat in a neighborhood that had changed drastically over the decades. Once a predominantly working-class community, it was now a mix of old and new faces. The younger families, many of whom didn't know Mr. John's history, rushed past him in the streets, while the older residents still gave him the familiar nod of respect as they passed. To them, Mr. John was a fixture in the community, a man who had worked hard his entire life and earned his rest. After his wife passed away a few years ago, Mr. John had learned to fill his days with small tasks. He tended to a tiny garden on the balcony, took long walks through the park, and visited the local grocery store every Wednesday. These trips gave him a sense of independence that he valued dearly. Even in his old age, he prided himself on being able to take care of his own needs. On this particular Wednesday, as he prepared for his weekly grocery trip, Mr. John felt a familiar sense of contentment. He dressed in his usual comfortable slacks and button-down shirt, grabbed his reusable grocery bag, and made his way down the street to the nearby supermarket. The streets were busy with the sounds of daily life. Kids rushing to school, cars honking, and vendors calling out to potential customers. Mr. John, walking at his own steady pace, smiled at the routine. Upon arriving at the supermarket, he went about his usual route, starting with the fruits and vegetables. He picked out a few apples, some bananas, and carefully examined a couple of tomatoes before placing them in his basket. His movements were slow but deliberate, a reflection of years spent doing things methodically. Yet, despite his calm demeanor, Mr. John couldn't help but notice a shift in the atmosphere. The young security guard near the entrance seemed to be watching him closely, almost too closely. Mr. John had seen him before, tall with a buzz cut, likely in his mid-20s, but they had never spoken. Today, however, the guard's gaze felt heavy, following him as he moved through the aisles. Mr. John tried to brush it off. "It's nothing," he thought to himself. "Just doing his job." But as he proceeded to pick up a few more essentials, bread, eggs, and milk, the uncomfortable feeling persisted. The security guard wasn't the only one watching him now. Customers glanced his way, whispering amongst themselves. Mr. John wasn't new to this. The suspicious looks, the silent judgment. It had followed him all his life. But here, in his local grocery store, a place he'd visited for years, it felt wrong. He made his way to the checkout line, trying to shake off the unease. The cashier, a young woman who had seen Mr. John many times before, greeted him with a polite smile. He paid for his items, placed them in his bag, and headed for the exit. Just as he was about to step outside, the heavy hand of the security guard landed on his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his voice cold. "I need you to come with me for a minute." The entire store seemed to go silent. Mr. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's this about?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. "We've received a report that you were seen taking something without paying," the guard replied, his tone sharp, eyes narrowing. Mr. John blinked, utterly confused. "Taking something? What are you talking about? I paid for everything. Please come with me," the guard repeated, this time more forcefully. Mr. John felt his stomach drop as whispers started to circulate around the store. Customers were staring, some with pity, others with judgment. He could feel their eyes on him. piercing through his skin like knives. His hands, once steady, began to tremble slightly as he tried to process what was happening. He had been a regular at the store for years, never causing trouble, always paying his dues. But none of that seemed to matter now. With no other choice, Mr. John followed the guard toward a small office in the back of the store. His footsteps echoed in the cold, sterile hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside the office, the manager sat behind a desk, looking uncomfortable but determined. A police officer had already arrived, standing by with crossed arms, watching the scene unfold. "Let's just get this sorted out quickly," the manager said, avoiding eye contact with Mr. John. The officer stepped forward, his voice firm. "Sir, we've been informed that you were seen placing items in your bag before paying at the register. We need to check your belongings." Mr. John, still in disbelief, handed over his grocery bag and pulled out his receipt. "I paid for everything," he repeated, his voice quiet but resolute. As they began inspecting his items, Mr. John could hardly believe what was happening. In a matter of minutes, his dignity was being stripped away. And for what? A misunderstanding? Prejudice? He had always prided himself on being an honest man, a man who worked hard for everything he had. Yet here he was, standing in a cold room, being treated like a common criminal. After a tense few moments, the officer handed the bag back to Mr. John. "It appears everything is in order," he said, his tone indifferent. The manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sorry about the confusion, Mr. John. It was just protocol, but the damage had already been done." Mr. John stood there, the weight of the accusation pressing down on him like a physical burden. The apologies felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the humiliation he had just endured. Without another word, he took his bag and left the office, his head held high but his heart heavy. As he stepped back into the sunlight, Mr. John's thoughts swirled. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of treatment, but at his age, it hurt differently. He had worked so hard, lived his life with integrity, and yet, here he was, being reduced to nothing more than a suspect because of the color of his skin. Something inside him shifted that day. He had spent too long letting things like this slide, brushing off the prejudice and discrimination that had followed him his entire life. But this time he couldn't. This time, he wouldn't let it go so easily. Mr. John walked home slowly, the events at the supermarket replaying over and over in his mind. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows on the familiar streets, but instead of bringing the usual sense of comfort, everything felt cold and distant. The hum of cars passing by and the chatter of people on the sidewalks faded into the background as his thoughts consumed him. How had things escalated so quickly? One moment he was minding his own business, doing his usual grocery shopping, and the next, he was being dragged to the back office like some sort of criminal. Even now, after proving his innocence, the humiliation lingered, settling deep in his bones. As he reached his apartment building, he hesitated at the door. His hand hovered over the handle for a second before pushing it open. He didn't want to go inside yet. Not like this. Instead, he walked past the entrance and sat down on the small bench outside. The cool evening air washed over him, but it did little to soothe the unrest brewing inside. He thought back to the way the security guard had looked at him, the way the officer had spoken to him with such casual authority, as if Mr. John's age and years of respect in the community meant nothing. It reminded him of incidents from his past, moments he had long tried to forget. Growing up in the South, Mr. John had seen more than his fair share of prejudice. He had fought his way through a lifetime of obstacles, segregation, discrimination, being passed over for promotions despite his hard work. But he had always managed to keep his dignity intact, refusing to let the weight of other people's ignorance break him. He had thought that by now, after everything he'd endured, things would be different, that maybe at his age, He could finally live in peace without having to fight for his right to simply exist. But today's incident proved otherwise. The sting of being accused, of being treated like he wasn't worth a second thought, was sharper than he expected. As the darkness deepened, Mr. John finally stood and made his way inside. His apartment felt empty, the silence amplifying the unease in his chest. He placed his grocery bag on the counter, glancing at the receipt that still lay inside. Everything was accounted for. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet he felt the burden of guilt, as if he had to defend his innocence to the world. Later that evening, as he sat at the small kitchen table, the phone rang. He reached for it, half expecting it to be another telemarketer or a wrong number. But when he heard his grandson's voice on the other end, a wave of relief washed over him. "Granddad, how are you?" Lucas asked, his voice full of youthful energy. "Been better, Lucas," Mr. John replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Lucas had always been a bright spot in Mr. John's life. A young lawyer, freshly out of law school, Lucas had grown up watching his grandfather work hard to provide for the family. He admired Mr. John's strength and perseverance, and they had always been close. "Something on your mind?" Lucas asked, sensing that something was off. Mr. John hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to burden Lucas with his problems, but the weight of the day's events was too much to carry alone. He found himself telling his grandson everything about the accusation, the security guard, the police officer, the way people had stared at him. As the words spilled out, Mr. John realized just how deeply the incident had affected him. "I don't know, Lucas," Mr. John said, his voice quiet. "I've faced stuff like this my whole life, but today, it just felt different. Maybe because I'm getting older. Maybe because I'm tired." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lucas spoke again, this time with a sharper edge in his voice. "That's not right, Granddad. What happened to you? It's not just some misunderstanding. They humiliated you, and that's not okay. You don't have to just accept it." Mr. John felt a flicker of something stir inside him, something that had been dormant for a long time. Could Lucas be right? Was there more he could do? "I know how you feel, Granddad. I really do," Lucas continued, his voice softening. "But we can't let people treat us like this anymore. Not without consequences. You taught me to stand up for what's right. And this, what happened to you, isn't right." Mr. John sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do, Lucas? I'm just an old man. They'll say it's a misunderstanding and move on. What's the point?" "The point is that it's not just about today," Lucas replied firmly. "This is about every time you've been treated unfairly, every time someone's made you feel less than. You've earned your place in this world, Granddad, and nobody has the right to take that from you. You should think about taking action." Mr. John sat quietly, absorbing his grandson's words. There was a part of him that wanted to believe Lucas was right, that there was something he could do to reclaim his dignity. But another part of him, the part that had been worn down by years of quiet endurance, wasn't so sure. "Think about it," Lucas said gently. "You don't have to decide anything now, but don't let them make you feel like you don't matter. You do." They said their goodbyes, and Mr. John sat alone again in the dim light of the kitchen. Lucas's words echoed in his mind, but the weight of the day still hung heavy on him. He glanced at the grocery bag on the counter, the small, everyday items that had somehow led to his humiliation. It didn't make sense. None of it did. For the next few days, Mr. John kept to himself, replaying the incident over and over. The memory of the officer's indifferent tone, the manager's hollow apology, and the stares of the customers all haunted him. Each time he tried to push it aside, the anger bubbled back up, stronger than before. Lucas called again a few days later. This time, his tone was even more determined. "I've been thinking, Granddad," Lucas said. "I think we should take this to court. You shouldn't have to go through something like this. It's not right, and they need to be held accountable. Mr. John hesitated, but something had shifted inside him. He was tired of being seen as less than, tired of letting things like this slide. He wasn't sure if he had the energy to fight, but Lucas was right. This wasn't just about what happened at the store. It was about a lifetime of indignities, small and large, that had chipped away at him. "All right, Lucas," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." The decision to take legal action weighed on Mr. John in ways he hadn't anticipated. Once the initial rush of determination had passed, he found himself questioning whether he had made the right choice. It had been years since he'd had to fight like this, to stand up for himself in such a public way. His life had always been about working hard, keeping his head down, and doing what needed to be done. But now, things were different. Lucas, however, was unwavering. As soon as Mr. John had given him the go-ahead, his grandson leaped into action. The next morning, Lucas arrived at Mr. John's apartment with a folder of notes and a fire in his eyes that reminded Mr. John of his younger self. "Granddad, this is going to be tough, but we've got a strong case," Lucas said, laying out the documents across the small dining table. The supermarket management, the security guard, they all acted in ways that could be challenged. "We have grounds for a lawsuit." Mr. John listened quietly as Lucas explained the legal avenues they could take. Words like defamation, unlawful detainment, and discrimination floated in the air, and while they were terms Mr. John had heard before, they felt foreign when applied to his own life. He never imagined that at his age, he'd be sitting here, preparing for a legal battle. "They humiliated you, Granddad. We're not just going to let that slide," Lucas continued, his voice filled with passion. "We'll start by filing a formal complaint with the supermarket. Then we'll take it from there." Mr. John nodded, though his mind was still swirling with doubts. He had always believed in letting things go, in avoiding conflict when possible. But after what happened, he realized that staying quiet only allowed the hurt to fester. If he didn't stand up for himself now, when would it ever change? "I just don't want to stir up trouble," Mr. John said, his voice soft but thoughtful. "I've lived a long life, Lucas. I've seen what happens when you try to fight too hard. Sometimes you end up worse off." Lucas leaned forward, his eyes locking with his grandfather's. "I understand, Granddad, but this isn't just about stirring up trouble. It's about making sure you're treated with the respect you deserve. You've done enough letting things go." That struck a chord with Mr. John. Lucas was right. All his life, he had let the small slights, the subtle insults, and the outright discrimination slide off his back, hoping that by keeping his head down, he'd find peace. But peace hadn't come. Instead, he had found himself weighed down by a lifetime of quiet endurance. "All right," Mr. John said, a slow resolve building in his voice. "Let's do it." The first step was filing a formal complaint. With Lucas's help, Mr. John drafted a letter addressed to the supermarket's management, detailing the events of that day, the accusation, the humiliation, the treatment he endured. It was a simple letter, but the weight of it was immense. For Mr. John, it was more than just words on paper. It was his first act of defiance in a long, long time. A few days later, Lucas informed him that the supermarket had responded. They apologized again and offered a small settlement, hoping to sweep the issue under the rug. But Lucas, as fiery and determined as ever, refused to let it go at that. "This isn't about money, Granddad," he said, shaking his head as he read the letter. "They're trying to make this go away with a check, but that's not enough. They need to be held accountable." Mr. John agreed. The apology felt as hollow as the one the manager had given him on the day of the incident. Money couldn't erase the way he had been made to feel, the way his dignity had been stripped from him in front of a store full of people. No, this wasn't something that could be paid off and forgotten. "We're moving forward with the lawsuit," Lucas declared, his tone resolute. "I've already reached out to some colleagues. They'll help us with the paperwork." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and legal consultations. Mr. John found himself sitting in offices, surrounded by lawyers and legal jargon that felt miles away from his quiet, simple life. But through it all, Lucas remained at his side, guiding him through the process and explaining everything in a way that made sense. The support gave Mr. John strength, but it didn't make the journey any easier. Every time he recounted the events of that day, it brought back the sting of humiliation, the weight of those accusatory stares. Each retelling felt like reopening an old wound, but it was necessary. He knew that now. As word spread in the community about what had happened, Mr. John found himself receiving unexpected support. Neighbors who had always nodded politely in passing began stopping him on the street, offering words of encouragement. Even people he didn't know well, like the cashier from the store or the man who owned the corner shop, came up to him, expressing their outrage at the way he had been treated. "You did the right thing, Mr. John," one neighbor said, patting him on the back. People can't keep getting away with this. Their support meant more to Mr. John than he could express. For so long, he had felt like he was carrying this burden alone. But now, he realized that others were standing with him. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs too. Despite the support, there were also those who criticized him. A few people in the neighborhood whispered that Mr. John was making too much of the situation, that he should have just let it go and moved on. They said he was stirring up trouble where there didn't need to be any. Mr. John had expected this. He knew that standing up for yourself wasn't always popular, especially in a community where many people were used to keeping their heads down. But this time, he refused to be swayed. He had spent too much of his life letting things slide, and now he was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. As the lawsuit gained momentum, Lucas worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, speaking to witnesses, and preparing their case. Mr. John, though still hesitant at times, found himself growing more and more determined as the weeks passed. The anger that had bubbled beneath the surface for so long was now fueling his resolve. One afternoon, as they sat in Mr. John's apartment going over some final details, Lucas paused and looked at his grandfather with a seriousness in his eyes. "Granddad, I need you to know something," Lucas said, his voice steady. "No matter how this turns out, you've already won in my eyes. You've shown me and everyone else what it means to stand up for yourself. And that's more powerful than any court ruling." Mr. John felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much this fight had meant to Lucas. For Mr. John, it was about reclaiming his dignity, but for Lucas, it was about so much more. It was about legacy, about showing the next generation that they didn't have to accept the injustices their elders had faced. "Thank you, Lucas," Mr. John said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I could have done this without you." Lucas smiled, placing a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "You've been doing it your whole life, Granddad. I'm just here to help you finish what you started." As they continued preparing for the trial, Mr. John felt a quiet strength building inside him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was fighting back. And no matter how the case turned out, he knew he had already taken the most important step. The courtroom was smaller than Mr. John had imagined. It felt almost claustrophobic, with rows of benches and a high, imposing bench where the judge would soon take his seat. The air inside was tense, the quiet chatter of people waiting for the trial to begin doing little to ease the nervous energy that filled the room. Mr. John sat beside Lucas at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting on his knees. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a steady rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock on the wall. Though he had tried to prepare himself for this day, nothing could have fully readied him for the reality of being here, of sitting in a courtroom where his dignity, his very worth as a person, was about to be judged. Lucas, ever the professional, was calm and collected. Dressed sharply in a suit, he looked every bit the young, confident lawyer he had become. But when he glanced over at his grandfather, there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You all right, Granddad?" Lucas asked quietly. Mr. John nodded, though his mouth was dry and his palms were clammy. "I'll be fine. Just thinking about everything." Lucas placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've got this. Stay strong." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the opposing side entered. The supermarket's legal team. They were a group of well-dressed lawyers, their faces expressionless as they took their seats across the aisle. Mr. John's eyes narrowed as he recognized one of the men with them, the store manager who had offered that weak apology after everything had happened. Seeing him here now, looking so confident and unbothered, stirred something in Mr. John's chest. This wasn't just about the incident anymore. This was about making sure people like him weren't treated like second-class citizens, invisible unless accused. The judge entered shortly after, and the trial officially began. Mr. John sat quietly as Lucas and the defense attorneys made their opening statements. Lucas spoke with passion, recounting the events of that day with a clarity that brought the memory back to life in the courtroom. He described how Mr. John had been unfairly targeted, humiliated, and detained, how the actions of the security guard and the officer had stripped his grandfather of his dignity. On the other side, the supermarket's lawyers downplayed the incident, framing it as a misunderstanding that had been handled appropriately. They argued that the store had acted within its rights to protect its property, and that any harm Mr. John had experienced was unintentional. Mr. John clenched his fists under the table as he listened to their cold, calculated words. They were trying to paint him as an overreacting old man, someone who had blown a simple situation out of proportion. But it wasn't simple to him. It never had been. As the trial progressed, witnesses were called. The security guard took the stand first, followed by the store manager. Each of them gave their version of events, their words carefully chosen to minimize their responsibility. The guard, in particular, tried to justify his actions by claiming he was just following protocol. Mr. John felt the anger bubbling up inside him again as he listened. He remembered the way the guard had looked at him that day, the suspicion in his eyes, the way he had grabbed his arm without a second thought. The guard hadn't seen an old man who had lived in this community for decades. He had only seen a potential thief. When it was Lucas's turn to cross-examine, he was relentless. He questioned the guard's actions, his judgment, and whether he had any real evidence to support his accusation. Slowly, piece by piece, Lucas dismantled their defense, exposing the flaws in their arguments. Then, it was time for Mr. John to take the stand. As he rose from his seat and walked to the witness box, a hush fell over the courtroom. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. But as he sat down and faced the room, he felt a calmness settle over him. He had spent his whole life keeping quiet, enduring things that should never have been endured. But today, he would speak his truth. Lucas began his questioning gently, guiding his grandfather through the events of that day. Mr. John spoke slowly, deliberately, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He described how it felt to be accused, how the humiliation had stayed with him long after he had left the store. He spoke about his life, about growing up in a world where he was often seen as less than, about how he had fought for everything he had, only to be treated like a common criminal in his old age. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, everyone listening intently to the story of a man who had lived through more than most could imagine. As Mr. John spoke, he felt the weight lifting from his shoulders, as if he was finally shedding years of silent suffering. When Lucas finished his questioning, the defense attorney stood. He approached Mr. John with a slick, practiced smile, clearly ready to poke holes in his testimony. "Mr. John, you lived a long life, haven't you?" the attorney began, his tone polite but condescending. Mr. John nodded. "Yes, I have. And in all those years, have you ever experienced something like this before? Being accused of something you didn't do?" Mr. John paused for a moment, then answered, "I've experienced worse, but that doesn't make this right." The attorney's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Surely, you understand that the store was simply trying to protect its property. Mistakes happen. Do you really believe this was about something more than a simple mistake?" Mr. John looked the attorney square in the eye. "It wasn't just a mistake. It was about how I was seen, about how people like me have always been seen. You don't grab someone and accuse them without cause just because they look like me." The attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting Mr. John's firm response. He tried to redirect the questioning, but each time, Mr. John responded with the same quiet strength. He wasn't here to be intimidated. Not anymore. By the time the defense had finished, it was clear that Mr. John's testimony had struck a chord with everyone in the room. He had spoken not just for himself, but for countless others who had endured the same kind of treatment. The closing arguments came and went, and then the trial was in the hands of the jury. Mr. John and Lucas left the courthouse that day feeling both exhausted and hopeful. They had done everything they could. Now, they had to wait. Days passed, and the tension weighed heavily on Mr. John. He tried to distract himself with his daily routines, but his mind kept drifting back to the trial, to the faces of the jurors, to the uncertainty of what would come next. Then, one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Lucas. "Granddad," Lucas said, his voice filled with emotion. "We won. The jury ruled in our favor." Mr. John sat down slowly, the weight of the news washing over him. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. After everything they had been through, after all the doubt and fear, they had won. "You did it, Granddad," Lucas continued. "We did it." Mr. John smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He had stood up for himself, for his dignity, and for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. And in the end, justice had been served. The news of Mr. John's victory in court spread quickly. Within days, his story had become the talk of the neighborhood. For years, people had whispered about the injustices they had faced, about the indignities they endured in silence. But now, Mr. John had done something few dared to do. He had fought back, and he had won. At first, Mr. John wasn't sure what to make of the attention. Neighbors who had once offered polite greetings now approached him with admiration in their eyes. Strangers who had only known him as the quiet elderly man from down the street suddenly stopped to congratulate him, to thank him for standing up. "You gave us hope, Mr. John," one woman said as she passed him at the corner store. "You showed them that we're not invisible." It was a strange feeling, being thrust into the spotlight after so many years of living on the margins. Mr. John had always preferred to keep to himself, to live his life quietly. But now, he felt the weight of something larger. This wasn't just about him anymore. His victory had become a symbol of something much bigger, a symbol of resistance, of dignity, of the power of standing up for what was right. At home, Lucas beamed with pride every time they talked about the case. The bond between them had deepened over the course of the trial. Their relationship transformed from one of quiet respect to something far stronger. Lucas had always admired his grandfather, but now he looked at him with a new sense of awe. "You know, Granddad," Lucas said one evening as they sat together in Mr. John's living room, "this case is going to be remembered. People are talking about it all over. They see you as a hero." Mr. John chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm no hero, Lucas. I just did what needed to be done." Lucas smiled, but his expression remained serious. "It's more than that, Granddad. You gave people a reason to believe things can change. That's powerful." Mr. John thought about that for a moment. He had never set out to be anyone's hero, but if his fight had inspired others, then maybe there was something good that could come out of all this pain. Maybe it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about sparking a change in the way people saw themselves and each other. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. John began to notice small shifts in the way he was treated. The corner store clerk greeted him with more warmth, asking about his day instead of simply handing him his change. The supermarket where the incident had taken place had made several changes as well. The management had issued a formal public apology, not just to Mr. John, but to the entire community, promising to review their policies on how customers were treated. But more importantly, people in the neighborhood began speaking up. It wasn't just about Mr. John's case anymore. Others started sharing their own stories of mistreatment, of discrimination they had faced in their daily lives. Some of these stories had been buried for years, too painful or too risky to bring up. But now, with Mr. John's victory as a backdrop, those stories were finding the light. One afternoon, as Mr. John was sitting on his porch, enjoying the warmth of the sun, a group of local community leaders approached him. Among them was Mrs. Evans, a longtime resident and a well-known activist in the neighborhood. "We've been talking, Mr. John," Mrs. Evans began, taking a seat beside him. "Your case, it's opened a lot of eyes. People are ready to make some changes. We're organizing a meeting to discuss what we can do as a community to ensure this doesn't happen again. We'd love for you to be there." Mr. John blinked in surprise. He had never considered himself a leader or an activist. His fight had been personal, something he did for his own dignity. But seeing the determination in Mrs. Evans's eyes, he realized that his struggle had grown beyond himself. People were looking to him for guidance, for strength. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," Mr. John said, his voice humble. "I've never been much of a speaker." Mrs. Evans smiled warmly. "You've already spoken louder than most ever will, Mr. John, just by standing up. You don't have to say much. Your presence is enough." Reluctantly, but feeling a sense of duty, Mr. John agreed to attend the meeting. That evening, he and Lucas walked together to the community center, where the gathering was being held. As they entered, Mr. John was greeted by faces both familiar and new. The room was packed with neighbors, local business owners, and even a few reporters who had caught wind of the story. The atmosphere was charged with energy, a sense of collective purpose hanging in the air. People were talking, exchanging ideas, and sharing stories of their own experiences with discrimination and injustice. For the first time in a long while, Mr. John felt a sense of hope, a hope that things might actually change, not just for him, but for everyone in his community. Mrs. Evans stood at the front of the room and called the meeting to order. She spoke about the importance of unity, about how they could no longer afford to remain silent when one of their own was mistreated. She talked about the need for systemic changes, both in how businesses operated and in how the community supported each other. When it was Mr. John's turn to speak, he felt a familiar nervousness settle in his chest. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, but as he stood in front of the crowd, he saw the expectant faces looking up at him, and something inside him shifted. He had been through too much to stay silent now. "I'm not used to speaking in front of people," Mr. John began, his voice steady but soft. "But I know what it feels like to be treated like you don't matter. I've spent my whole life dealing with it in one way or another. But this time, I couldn't let it go. This time, I had to stand up." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What happened to me wasn't right. But I'm not the only one this has happened to. I'm just one of many. And I'm here to say that it's time for us to stop accepting it. We deserve better. Our children, our grandchildren, they deserve better." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Mr. John continued. "We can't change the past, but we can change how we move forward. We can make sure that when something like this happens again, and it will happen again, we're ready to stand together, because that's the only way things will change." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Mr. John returned to his seat, feeling both overwhelmed and humbled by the response. He hadn't expected to become a voice for change, but now that he realized how much power there was in speaking up, in refusing to stay silent. After the meeting, several people approached him, thanking him for his courage and for inspiring them to take action. Some shared their own plans to challenge discriminatory practices in their workplaces, while others talked about organizing neighborhood watch groups to support each other. As Mr. John walked home that night with Lucas by his side, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about winning the court case anymore. It was about the ripple effect that his fight had created. It was about a community coming together, standing up for their rights, and refusing to be pushed aside. "Granddad," Lucas said as they reached the steps of the house, "I think this is just the beginning." Mr. John nodded, a small smile on his lips. "I think you're right." The days following the community meeting brought a renewed sense of purpose to Mr. John's life. He felt invigorated, as if he had shed a heavy coat of doubt that had clung to him for years. Each morning, he woke up with a sense of anticipation, ready to embrace whatever the day had to offer. For the first time in a long while, he didn't just feel like a bystander in his own life. He felt like an active participant. The neighborhood was abuzz with energy. Neighbors greeted each other with renewed enthusiasm, sharing plans for initiatives and support networks. Mr. John found himself at the center of it all, a figurehead for the change they all wanted to see. Though he still carried the weight of his past experiences, he was determined not to let it define him any longer. One afternoon, as Mr. John sat on his porch sipping lemonade, Lucas approached him with an envelope in hand. "Granddad, look what I found in the mailbox," he said, excitement bubbling in his voice. Mr. John raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it?" Lucas handed him the envelope, and Mr. John opened it to reveal an invitation to speak at a local community forum. "They want you to share your story, your experiences. It's a chance to address local leaders and community members about what happened and the importance of change." Mr. John's heart raced at the thought of speaking again. Part of him felt honored, but another part hesitated. "Lucas, I'm not sure if I can do that. What if I get nervous?" "You'll be fine, Granddad. Just remember, you're not speaking for yourself alone. You're speaking for everyone who feels like their voice doesn't matter. And you've already inspired so many." As the date approached, Mr. John spent time preparing for his speech. Lucas helped him organize his thoughts, encouraging him to share not only the details of the incident, but also the broader implications of systemic racism and the importance of community solidarity. Together, they practiced in front of the mirror, with Lucas pretending to be the audience. "You've got this," Lucas said after each run-through. "Just speak from the heart." Finally, the day of the forum arrived. As Mr. John stepped onto the stage, he felt a wave of nerves wash over him. The auditorium was filled with people, neighbors, community leaders, even some local journalists. But as he looked out at the crowd, he noticed familiar faces. People who had supported him, who had stood by him throughout the trial. Their encouraging smiles eased his nerves. Mr. John took a deep breath and began. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I want to share my story, but more importantly, I want to talk about our story, our community's story." He recounted the events that had led to the court case, emphasizing the feelings of humiliation and injustice he had felt. He spoke about the importance of recognizing systemic issues that affected not just him, but countless others who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. As he continued, he could see people nodding, some even leaning in closer, captivated by his words. The nervousness that had initially gripped him began to fade, replaced by a sense of empowerment. He wasn't just telling his story. He was speaking for those who felt silenced. "I realized," Mr. John said, "that what happened to me was not just an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a larger problem. But we have the power to change that. Together, we can create a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." When he finished, the audience erupted in applause. Mr. John felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. It wasn't just applause for him. It was applause for a shared hope for change, for a future where everyone could stand tall without fear of being judged based on the color of their skin. After the forum, Mr. John was approached by several community leaders who expressed their gratitude for his courage. They discussed plans to implement workshops on diversity and inclusion, to educate the community about racial biases, and to ensure that the voices of marginalized individuals were heard. "I want to help," Mr. John said when they mentioned future initiatives. "I may not be an expert, but I want to be involved in whatever way I can." Over the next few months, Mr. John found himself increasingly engaged in community efforts. He attended meetings, participated in discussions, and even led a few workshops about his experiences and the importance of advocacy. He shared stories from his life, teaching younger generations about resilience and the need for awareness. As he became more involved, Mr. John's confidence grew. He started to see himself not just as a victim of circumstance, but as a crucial part of a movement for change. The community recognized his dedication, and with every story he shared, He felt a piece of his old self being restored, a self that had once been silenced but was now empowered. One evening, as Mr. John and Lucas walked home from a meeting, Lucas turned to him. "You know, Granddad, you're making a real difference. People are listening to you. They're taking your words to heart." Mr. John smiled, feeling the warmth of pride swell within him. "I just hope it's enough. I want to leave a better world for the kids." Lucas nodded, his expression serious. "You are. And it's not just about them. It's about everyone who's felt alone or marginalized. You're showing them they're not." That evening, as Mr. John prepared for bed, he reflected on how far he had come, from the man who had been humiliated in a supermarket to someone who was leading conversations about change. It was a transformation he had never anticipated. He felt like a phoenix rising from the ashes, and for the first time in years, he truly believed in the power of his voice. The community initiative sparked by Mr. John's activism began to take root quickly. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of ideas and plans that had long been held back by fear and uncertainty. Meetings were organized weekly at the community center, where residents brainstormed ways to address the issues of racism and discrimination head-on. Mr. John found himself in the thick of it, not just as a participant, but as a leader. His experiences provided a foundation for discussions, and people were eager to learn from him. He listened as neighbors shared their own stories of struggle and resilience, each tale adding another layer to the community's collective narrative. One of the first initiatives that emerged was a mentorship program for young people. Many teenagers in the neighborhood faced challenges that often led them down the wrong path. With Mr. John's encouragement, a group of volunteers stepped forward to mentor the youth, offering guidance, support, and the kind of life lessons only lived experience could provide. "Think of it as passing the torch," Mr. John explained during one meeting. "These kids need to see that they have options, that they can rise above the circumstances they find themselves in." The program quickly gained traction, with local high school students signing up to be ments. Mr. John took special care to match mentors with kids who shared similar backgrounds and interests. He knew that connection would be key to making the program work. As the mentors began to work with their ments, Mr. John watched with pride as relationships blossomed. Every Saturday, the community center buzzed with activity. The program held workshops on everything from resume writing and interview skills to discussions about identity and self-worth. Mr. John often facilitated these sessions, sharing his own journey and encouraging the youth to express themselves openly. "Your voice matters," he would say, looking each young person in the eye. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Word of the mentorship program spread, and soon parents began to take notice. They expressed gratitude for the initiative and sought ways to support it. Mr. John proposed that the program host a community event, a day of fun, food, and connection, where families could come together, learn about the program, and celebrate their achievements. The event planning turned into a collaborative effort, with neighbors contributing ideas, resources, and time. The atmosphere was electric with excitement. Mr. John felt a surge of energy as he watched everyone come together, united by a common goal. When the day of the event arrived, the community center was transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and tables overflowed with delicious food, courtesy of the local restaurants that had donated meals. Families mingled, children laughed, and the air was filled with the sounds of joy and celebration. Mr. John stood at the entrance, welcoming everyone with a warm smile. As he observed the camaraderie and connection, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what he had fought for, not just for himself, but for his community. As the festivities kicked off, Mr. John took the stage to address the crowd. His heart swelled with pride as he looked out at the sea of familiar faces. "Today, we celebrate not just our achievements, but our strength as a community," he began. "Each of you has played a part in making this happen. Together, we are proving that love, unity, and resilience can overcome any challenge. The crowd erupted in applause, and Mr. John felt the warmth of their support envelop him. He went on to share stories of the mentorship program, highlighting the connections being forged and the positive impact it was having on the youth. As the day unfolded, Mr. John wandered through the crowd, stopping to chat with families and neighbors. He saw young men proudly showcasing their artwork, sharing stories of their growth and learning. The joy on their faces reminded him of why he had stepped into this role in the first place. Later in the day, he was approached by Mrs. Evans, who had been instrumental in organizing the event. "You really made a difference, Mr. John," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "This wouldn't have been possible without your leadership." Mr. John shook his head, feeling a sense of humility wash over him. "I may have started it, but it's the community that keeps it going. It's the people coming together that make the real change." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the community center, Mr. John took a moment to reflect. He had come so far from that fateful day in the supermarket, and now he was part of something much larger than himself. He had turned his pain into purpose, and it was paying off in ways he could have never imagined. But even amid the celebrations, Mr. John remained aware of the challenges that lay ahead. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and he knew that their work was only beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more stories to tell, and more voices to uplift. As the event came to a close, Mr. John gathered the volunteers and mentors for a brief meeting. "This is just the start," he said, looking around at the determined faces. "Let's keep pushing forward. Let's continue to create spaces for our community to grow and thrive." With renewed determination, they began discussing plans for future workshops, community outreach, and ways to sustain their efforts. Each idea sparked enthusiasm, and as they mapped out the next steps, Mr. John felt a sense of hope growing within him. The seeds of change had been planted, and together, they were ready to nurture them into something beautiful. The months rolled on, and the community initiatives began to take on a life of their own. Mr. John, now a beloved figure in the neighborhood, continued to lead the charge in creating spaces for dialogue, education, and empowerment. His story had ignited a movement, and the momentum was palpable. The mentorship program flourished, with more volunteers stepping up to guide the youth. The workshops expanded, covering topics like financial literacy, self-advocacy, and mental health. The community center had transformed into a hub of activity, a place where residents came not just to learn, but to connect and support one another. One evening, as Mr. John prepared for another workshop, he reflected on how far he had come. He had once felt invisible, but now he stood at the forefront of a community transformation. Each young person who walked through the doors of the community center represented hope, a promise for a brighter future. At the next workshop, Mr. John noticed several new faces in the crowd. They were eager and full of questions, their eyes bright with curiosity. As he began his presentation, he felt a surge of energy. He shared not just information, but his own experiences, encouraging the attendees to share their thoughts and concerns. "This isn't just about learning," he said, his voice steady. "It's about building a community where everyone feels valued. Your voices matter, and together we can create change." As the session unfolded, Mr. John was heartened to see participants engaging with each other, forming connections and sharing their own stories. The room buzzed with the energy of people determined to make a difference. After the workshop, several attendees approached him, expressing gratitude for his words. "You inspire us, Mr. John," one young woman said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you for showing us that we can be leaders too." Those words touched Mr. John deeply. He had always believed in the power of community, but seeing it come to life before his eyes was something he had never anticipated. As the weeks turned into months, the community's initiatives began to gain attention beyond their neighborhood. Local news stations featured stories about their work, and community leaders from other areas reached out to learn from their successes. Mr. John was invited to speak at various events, sharing not only his journey but also the lessons they had learned along the way. But even amid the growing recognition, Mr. John remained grounded. He knew that true change required sustained effort and commitment. He emphasized the importance of perseverance, reminding everyone that progress was a marathon, not a sprint. One afternoon, while he was cleaning up after a workshop, Lucas stopped by the community center. "Granddad, guess what? We're getting requests from other neighborhoods for mentorship programs. They want to replicate what we've done here." Mr. John's heart swelled with pride. "That's amazing, Lucas. It shows that what we're doing here is resonating. We need to support them in any way we can." As they discussed the logistics of expanding the program, Mr. John couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment wash over him. He had turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful catalyst for change, not just for himself but for countless others. One evening, as he sat on his porch reflecting on the journey, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The pain he had endured had shaped him, but it had also fueled his desire for justice. He thought about the young people he had mentored, the lives he had touched, and the community he had helped to empower. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Mrs. Evans, her face alight with excitement. "Mr. John, you won't believe it. We've been invited to present our program at the upcoming community summit. They want us to share our story on a larger platform." Mr. John felt a rush of exhilaration. "This is incredible. It's our chance to reach even more people." As they prepared for the summit, Mr. John felt the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders. He knew that their success was not just about recognition. It was about inspiring others to stand up against injustice and create meaningful change in their own communities. The day of the summit arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. As Mr. John stood on stage alongside other community leaders, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. The audience was filled with individuals eager to learn, and he could see hope reflected in their eyes. As he shared his story, he emphasized the importance of solidarity and resilience. "We are all connected," he said passionately. "Each of us has a role to play in this fight for justice. Let us not forget that our voices have power. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." When he finished speaking, the applause that followed felt like a wave of affirmation. He stepped off the stage, heart racing, filled with gratitude for the journey he had taken in the community that had stood by him. As he mingled with attendees afterward, people approached him to share their own stories, seeking advice and guidance. Mr. John listened intently, offering support and encouragement, knowing that the impact of their work extended far beyond their neighborhood. In the months that followed, the seeds of change continued to flourish. The mentorship program expanded to several neighboring communities, each adapting it to meet their unique needs. Mr. John remained committed to ensuring that every voice was heard and every story told. Reflecting on his journey, Mr. John realized that the humiliation he had experienced in that supermarket had been a pivotal moment in his life. It had pushed him to confront the injustices around him, to seek change not just for himself, but for others who had felt marginalized and silenced. As he looked out over his neighborhood, he saw a community transformed, a community that had come together in solidarity, ready to face challenges head-on. The laughter of children echoed in the streets, and the sense of hope was palpable. And so, Mr. John continued his work, fueled by the knowledge that every step forward was a step toward a better future. He knew that while the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, together, they could create a legacy of resilience, one that would inspire generations to come. In the end, Mr. John had not just turned his life around. He had sparked a movement, a testament to the power of courage, community, and the unwavering belief that change was possible.